Element A, identifying patients for care management. This is looking that the practice establishes a process and has criteria set to identify patients that they think will benefit from care management. So from these various factors, we're looking at specific conditions and specific patients that will benefit. So for factor 1, behavioral health conditions, I've included a little insert there from NCQA specifically for the pediatric practices, that pediatric practices may identify children and adolescents with special health care needs, so to fit that factor. Factor 2, high cost, high utilization, so your patients that have frequent ER visits in a specific time period, readmission rates that are higher. Factor 3, poorly controlled or complex conditions. Factor 4, any of your social determinants of health. Factor 5 is looking that there is some type of consideration for patients that are referred to either by someone else within the practice, so any staff, anyone that has interactions in the office with the patient. It could be from a hospital, it could be from any payers that provide lists of high-risk patients. Just that there is consideration for these patients as well that can be referred to by some type of outside organization. Could also be by a family member of the patient that decides that they think their loved one would not be able to go forward with their treatment of care if they aren't helped with someone and assisted by this care management process. Factor 6 is the critical factor, and this is looking at the practice monitors and looks at the different patients that are included in each of these conditions and monitors the percent of the total population that's identified through these different criteria. There's no rule on what the percent needs to be for that. It's just, again, that it's being monitored. And then the patients that are identified in this element are going to be used to draw a sample for the medical record review and looking in the record for specific information for elements B and C, which we'll look at in a few minutes. So scoring for this element, you can see there, again, including factor 6 to get the most scoring because of it being the critical factor. Meeting 5 of the factors, including factor 6, to reach 100%. And looking at the documentation for the first 5 factors, some type of process that describes the criteria and conditions used to identify those patients for each factor. And then for the final factor, a report that shows the number and percent of the total population identified through those different conditions that are likely to benefit from care management. So as you can see there, it says through either one factor or through a combination of factors that's determined by the practice. So in the box there, I've included a note, not all factors or every single patient identified using factors 1 through 5 needs to be included in the list for factor 6. So this can be any combination of those factors. It's not creating a list of everyone with that specific behavioral health condition and that complex condition and social determinant of health. It's just looking at a combination that the practice decides upon. It's not all of those patients that are going to be enlisted in care management. This I took directly from NCQA, just a few other notes about identifying these patients. So for factors 1 through 5, there you are going to be identifying all of those patients with those conditions. And that, again, is just looking for a percent of your patient population that falls into those conditions. Patients may fit into more than one factor. Obviously, you could have a patient that falls into the specific behavioral health condition that is being looked at, and also those that are your high-cost patients, maybe frequent ER visits. That same patient can obviously fall into both of those criteria, and for looking at the percentages for that factor, that is the way you would want to look at it. Looking towards the bottom here, patients are counted once even if they are identified under several factors, and this is referring to factor 6. So that is where you're only looking at unique patients. So again, if you are looking at your patients that are have a behavioral health condition and high-cost utilization patients, and there's a patient that falls into both of those categories, when simply noting in the report the percentages for that specific factor, it's okay to have the patient fall into both categories. But when you're looking at the combination of those in factor 6, you're just looking at the unique patients. Here are some different example scenarios to just, again, reiterate the point that it's not looking at every single patient that falls into all of these categories. So I think the one on the right is a little bit easier to look at. If the practice would identify all patients with high utilization and all patients with 2 or more chronic conditions, they would be looking at factor 2, which is the high utilization, and factor 3, your poorly controlled or complex conditions. And there they include the note that the process for identifying these patients just needs to produce enough patients for the chart review, and that's referring to 30 patients. So as long as in those 2 criteria that are chosen, 30 patients fall into that, then that would be all that is needed to report for that. I don't think that this slide is in the handout that I sent yesterday. I had just included it to let you know that these are conditions that we are looking at everyone to include. So it's trying to take some of that burden away from the practice of having to sit down and choose conditions and decide what would be best. We have looked at things that we are reporting in other programs such as PQRS and those that we believe would be most beneficial. So looking at these conditions for each of those factors, just to give you an idea that we are going ahead and doing that for you and be able to help you create those lists easily through the central office. Okay, moving on to element B, care planning and self-care support. So you can see that this is the must-pass element, and this is looking at the areas of intervention and where you're implementing the care for these patients that we identified. The care team and patient collaborate to develop and update an individual care plan that includes the following features. And as you can see there, for at least 75% of the patients identified in element A. So at least 75% of the patients identified in that last factor 6 from the previous element must meet these requirements in order to receive credit for each factor. So this is where we would be looking at those patients that were identified in factor 6 of element 4A and looking in the medical record for these specific things to be in there for at least 75 of the patients so that to receive credit for each factor. Factor 1, incorporating patient preferences and functional and lifestyle goals. Factor 2, identifying treatment goals. Factor 3, assesses and addresses potential barriers of meeting goals. So if there's a history of noncompliance, for example, just noting that this is addressed and it's discussed with the patient so that they can help meet their goals and get over whatever barrier they may have. Factor 4 includes a self-management plan. So looking at goals again and ways to monitor self-care, the way that patients can record and help with their care while they're not in the office with the provider. And factor 5, that this is provided in writing to the patient. And again, if possible, if needed, this, depending on the specific patient, this might need to be in a different language for them or geared towards if they are not understanding their care and assessing for health literacy. If it's needed, that would also obviously be provided to them in whatever way they need. The scoring and documentation for this element, again, looking at the possible points, and included there on the bottom is just the CMS definition of a care plan and specific things that we obviously want in there. For the documentation, this is another area where, as I mentioned in the previous webinar for Standard 3, where NCQA offers a record review workbook. So for all of those factors, the record review workbook is something that can be used if running a report to find where that information is within the medical record is difficult to do depending on where that's being reported. They provide this tool so that we could record things that way if that's easier. And it doesn't have to be used for every single factor. If factors 1 and 2, we can easily run a report and find where that information is in these patients' records, we can do so. And if for factors 3, 4, and 5, they're in a field in MedEnt that is not easy to pull the report, then we can just document it this way by going through those patients' records and noting either yes or no in the workbook. So again, here is just a screenshot of what the record review workbook looks like for this specific element. Obviously, we're looking on the last element, 4B. So each factor, again, has its own column, and each row would be a different patient. So we would be looking, if needed, to use this tool, again, if the report can't be run for it, to look at each cell has a drop-down menu of yes or no, and we would be able to identify if those patients have this in their medical record. And again, for at least 75% of those patients, we would need to see yes in order to get the points required for the factor. For this information pulling from the medical records, we can go back up to 12 months from their last care visit to find if this documentation is in the patient record. For this specific element, they give a little bit more leeway as far as you can go back. So if we were looking at the last care visit as being this month, if it was June of 2015, we would be able to go back to June of 2014 and look in that past year, and anything with those factors that were in the patient record would be okay to submit for that. Element C is medication management. Here you'll see an area where we have a meaningful use alignment. So this element is looking at the practice having a process for managing medications, systematically implements the process. So you can see there factor 1 is the critical factor and also a meaningful use requirement, looking that the practice reviews and reconciles medications for more than 50% of the patients received from care transitions. Factor 2, basically the same thing, just looking for a higher percent threshold, so greater than 80%. So if we would look at that meaningful use report and the practice was over 80%, whereas the meaningful use requirement is 50%, we would just be able to use that report for both factors 1 and 2 since they're over the 80%. Factor 3 provides information about new prescriptions to more than 80% of patients. So this is looking at, obviously providing information about possible side effects, the consequences of not taking the medication, why they're taking it, just so that there's some type of documentation that this information was provided to new prescriptions, about new prescriptions. Factor 4 assesses the understanding of medications for more than 50% of patients and dates the assessment. Factor 5 assesses the response to medications and barriers to adherence for more than 50% of the patients. So looking at documentation again of discussing any problems or challenges with adhering to the medications, if they're not taking the medications, discussing why and any ways that they can be helped with that. So again, just documentation that that assessment occurred. Factor 6 documents over-the-counter medications, herbal therapies, and supplements for more than 50% of the patients. Again, you can see the scoring and including factor 1, which was the critical factor. So 5 factors, including factor 1, is needed to reach the 100% of the 4 points possible. The documentation you'll see is the same as the last element. It's another area where, again, if it's a field that we can run a report through MedInt and show the number of patients, percent of patients who have that information in their medical record, we could easily do that. And if not, again, the workbook that we can go into the patient's record and note whether each factor, each condition is in their record. The fourth element, element 4D, using electronic prescribing. Again, a few areas here that you can see are meaningful use requirements. But looking at the practice uses an electronic prescription system with the following capabilities. More than 50% of eligible prescriptions are written by the practice are compared to drug formularies and electronically sent to pharmacies. Factor 2 enters electronic medication orders in the medical record for more than 60% of medications. Factor 3 performs patient-specific checks for drug-drug and drug allergy interactions. And the fourth factor alerts prescribers to generic alternatives. So all functionalities that we know we have within our system. The points possible for element 4D and the documentation. So for factor 1, they're looking for a report and a screenshot displaying the formulary decision support mechanism that's in the system. Factor 2, a report, again, looking at those, the functionalities, and factors 3 and 4, either a report from the system or screenshots, again, demonstrating the capabilities. Moving on to the final element, element 4E, support self-care and shared decision-making. You can see there the intent and the meaning behind this element is that the practice has and demonstrates the use of materials to support patients and families in self-management and shared decision-making. The first factor there you can see, again, another meaningful use requirement, using the EHR to identify patient-specific education resources and providing them to more than 10% of the patients. Factor 2, providing educational materials and resources to the patients. So this is any type of brochures, handouts, if you refer them to a video or a website, any of that educational materials that you provide. Factor 3 provides self-management tools to record self-care results. So logging of if it's a patient that is looking to, their treatment goals includes weight loss, if it's providing them with a log to keep track of either their exercise routines or their meals, some type of recording self-care results for the patient to have with them outside of the practice. Factor 4, adopt shared decision-making aids. So this is looking at, this is different than the self-management tool. This is looking at if the patient's treatment if they had two options of treatment that provided the same results, and this is looking that the provider discusses with the patient those different options and doesn't necessarily advise them on one or the other, but works with them to see what their preferences are, the risks associated with it, any barriers with either the two treatments. So looking at, again, that this is a shared decision-making tool that's used with the patient and the provider for them to help decide what their best plan of care is. Again, this is if something, there are two options that basically have the same results for the patient and allowing them to help choose that decision. Factor 5 offers or refers patients to structured health education programs, such as group classes and peer support. So note there offers or refers because it says or refers. This doesn't need to be the practice actually providing the point of care. Again, it could be referring them to these different programs. Factor 6 maintains a current resource list on 5 topics or community service areas. So I'll show you an example of these, but these are any services that that you can refer in the community, whether it be for weight management services, child care services, dental services, smoking cessation. They're looking that you keep a list of at least 5 topics that you can offer to your patients. And the last factor assesses usefulness of identified community resources. So not only providing them and saying, here you go, you can use these, but looking to make sure that those that you're providing are useful to the patients. So whether that be some type of survey or just through patient feedback that you're documenting, if you're told that one of the resources that you offer has limited availability, is very often full, or they don't offer meetings at convenient times, just some type of way that you're looking that these resources are actually being used and in a useful way by the patients. There you can see the scoring and documentation for the Factor 1 or report showing the patients provided educational resources. Again, that's one of the meaningful use requirements that the report can be used for if meeting that. Factors 2 through 5, 3 examples of the different resources or tools that are provided. Factor 6, materials demonstrating that the practice offers at least 5 resources. And Factor 7, either, again, a survey or other materials showing how you collect information to assess how useful these different resources are that you're providing. So here are just some examples. You can see on the left there for Factors 2 and 3, just some online resources that you can provide. Again, it could easily be as easy as a handout with websites and ways to direct them. The top few examples there are actually apps for your phone where you can use to monitor your diabetes, your weight, blood pressure, tracking. So some different tools there that can be used as resources. On the right-hand side, these are services and resources that are actually here in Schuylkill County that I put together so that you can see that, I'm sure that you have a lot of these resources and are easily able to offer these resources, but having them in some type of format that you have the contact information and all of these resources in one spot. You can see there for behavioral health services, child development, alcohol support services. These are actual services local here. And at the bottom I included a website that is the Schuylkill County Human Services Directory. So very easy to go to this website, lets you filter on whatever service you're looking for, has a huge list, and will then tell you the local services and all of the contact information and what types of patients would benefit from those services. So an easy tool to use there to help easily have 5 services that your patients can be provided. So at this point, does anyone have any questions? Kind of a lot of information and a lot to look at as far as different conditions and populations. So if anyone has any questions. Okay, well, if we don't have any questions, thank you again for logging on. And if any questions do come up, please feel free to contact me. And this webinar, as well as the other ones, will be recorded for you to reference back to in the future. Thank you.